Hello, everybody, and welcome to Inclusively. I am Monica Paolini from Senza Fili, and I'm one of your hosts. The other one is my pal, Chris Lewis, from Chris Insights. And today we're going to talk about employment. How can we make sure that um, uh, disabled people of all sorts of types are able to have access to the work place. And we have Jane Hatton, who is the founder and CEO at Evenbreak, to talk to us about it. So Jane, welcome to Inclusively.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So as we always do, could you give us an introduction about who you are, where you're coming from, and what is it you do at Evenbreak?
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's great to be here. Evenbreak is a social enterprise that I founded in 2011, really to try and aim at to close the disability employment gap that is endemic across the world in all sorts of different ways. And we're a social enterprise, so we're not for profit. And we are all disabled people. So everybody at Evenbreak has a disability of some description. So it might be neurodiverse, it might be mental health, it might be mobility, whatever it might be. So that we have lived experience of the barriers that candidates face when they're looking for work. And so we learnt from disabled people that one of the biggest barriers they face when they're looking for work is actually not knowing which employers will take them seriously, because every employer now says we are an equal opportunities employer or we are a inclusive employer, but actually for disabled people often that's not the case. As soon as the employer finds out they're disabled, that's when they're rejected. So we have a job board, which is global. We're in fact the only global job board that's run by and for disabled people, which connects talented disabled candidates with inclusive employers, but we also offer support to employers and to disabled candidates. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. So everything we're going to talk about today is very, very dear to me and to Evenbreak.
And it's so important because I certainly remember back a long time ago when I was applying for jobs. I used to put blind on the application form, and
Yeah,
then you get through to certain companies, and then you get rejected. Then I wouldn't put blind on. I get through to more companies and then get rejected.
yeah,
And so it's still the situation today. And I suspect in terms of the recruitment process, especially as people use more and more AI around that, it becomes
yeah,
is AI, and we're jumping way ahead here, but is AI
yeah.
more of a barrier than it is a help to
I think
many
it
good
can be both.
candidates?
I think it can be both. I think in the recruitment process, it could definitely be a barrier because rather than a human looking at, say, CVs or application forms, there's a bot that's looking at it and it's looking for certain things. And whoever has programmed, where AI gets its information from is humans initially, isn't it? Or the information that's out there. And humans are by definition biased. And so the AI sifting process is also biased. And it might be looking for things like how many years' experience has this candidate got in this sector? And actually, that might not be relevant. They might have all the skills that are needed for that job, but they might have gained it in another sector. Or they may have gaps in their CV for very legitimate reasons, or their work history might not be as impressive as someone who hasn't routinely been discriminated against when they've gone for jobs. So their CV doesn't reflect their ability to do the job. So I think AI can be a huge barrier in terms of sifting, but I think it can be a huge enabler in terms of disabled people applying for jobs, help to fill in forms, help to sell themselves better. What we're not good at as disabled people is telling people what we're good at because the world is so busy telling us what we can't do. It's quite difficult to focus on actually, but these are the things I can do. And AI can be really quite helpful in that respect. So I think it's both. It can be used in a very positive way, but currently, as it's used in the recruitment process, can be really quite a big barrier because it will discriminate against people for no reason that's to do with their ability to do the job.
And it's, I think, what is really fascinating, and when we on inclusively, we've looked at both sides of this about the opportunities for the consumers, the
Yes.
consumers of services, but the employment, building a more diverse workforce and giving people the opportunities, the technology. I mentioned being blind. I use a lot of screen reader technology and assistive technology.
Yeah.
Actually, the ability to have those services give people the support once they're in a job to be able to provide extremely valuable input is an incredibly valuable thing. Do you come across many companies who've got that sort of structure in place where they're positively trying to drive a more diverse workforce, including, I won't say all forms of disability, but a wide range
Yeah.
of disabilities?
Yes, I mean, I would say all of our clients pretty much that's why they're using us because they recognize, I think there's a lot of negativity around disability and there's a lot of myths and assumptions around disabled employees won't be as productive or they'll always be off sick or they'll need lots of expensive adaptations or they won't have the skills that other people have got. And we know that none of that's true. And a lot of companies are now recognizing through necessity because of skill shortages that they have to go out to more talent. And what they're realizing is that actually, we call our candidates at Evenbreak premium candidates. Because if you're disabled, by definition, we talk very much about the social model of disability. You face obstacles that other people don't face every day of your life, and you have to develop skills to navigate around those obstacles like creative thinking, like problem solving, like determination, all of those things that we know about. And I think increasingly employers are initially, we need to go out to larger markets for recruitment because we have these skill shortages. But then when they start taking on disabled candidates, realize, oh, actually, there's a whole pool of talent out there that we've been ignoring all these years. So I think there's a growing, far too slow, but a growing realization that actually employing disabled people isn't just going to mean we can access more talent, but in lots of ways, better talent. And so I think employers are recognizing that this is a valuable source of talent, but also if you gear your organization up, whether it's with assistive technology, whether it's with more inclusive recruitment processes, actually that benefits everybody. It's not just, if you
Yeah.
think about, I don't know, Siri or whatever the equivalent is, that was initially for people with sight impairment, but everybody uses it now because it's much quicker. And if you have a recruitment process that removes barriers for disabled candidates, it also removes barriers for other candidates. So I think employers are very slowly realizing that disability inclusion is imperative for business success. It's not just a nice to have add-on that's something to do with CSR or charity. It's actually a business imperative, but it's very slow, and those employers are few and far between.
And do you mainly work with large corporates? Is that?
Yeah, we do. It's we work with a lot of global companies. So we work with Apple and Unilever and Mace and Microsoft and organizations like that. But we also work with some very, very small organizations. And sometimes small organizations perceive that disability equality is only possible for the big players who've got lots of departments and lots of budget, and they can have a D&I department and they can have a assistive technology department. I don't think that's the case. As a small business ourselves, there are 24 of us at Evenbreak, and as I say, we're all disabled, so that's the equivalent of about 40. But it's so much easier to be flexible and to do things like job carving. Maybe that person can do 80% of that job extremely well, but there's 20% that maybe either they don't enjoy or they struggle with. Let's give that 20% to somebody who would enjoy that. And it's much easier to be flexible, I think, when you're a small organization than when you're a larger organization. So for me, disability inclusion is important for employers of all sizes. But I would say the majority of the jobs on our board is kind of your 80-20. Probably 80% of the jobs on our board are from our 20% of large global or,
Yeah.
national employers.
And what about
Let me
public
ask you this.
sector? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go on. I say, what about
Yeah,
public sector? Because I think the public sector is one that has traditionally employed a lot of disabled people.
You think? Wouldn't you
So
think?
I would have thought so. Civil service, there's a good,
Yeah.
and obviously my experience is mainly vision impairment, right? So,
Yeah.
but so I'm conscious of how many vision impaired people end up working in different parts of the civil service.
Yeah.
And is that your experience around the world? That government departments have been more
Not as
open?
much as you think. When I started Evenbreak in 2011, my assumption was, because my background is public sector, I'd always worked in local authorities, that the public sector would be much more open to disability inclusion than the private sector would be. So I thought that most of our jobs initially would come from the public sector and maybe charities. And I was incredibly wrong. Partly, I think, because we were just at the end of the sort of financial crisis, which had hit the public sector later than it had hit the private sector. So they just weren't recruiting anybody, whether disabled or not. So that was part of that reason. But actually, what we found was that the private sector were employing disabled people for what I would call the right reasons, because they needed the talent and they recognized that talent. Whereas some public sector organizations were still doing it for the kind of CSR
Yeah.
targets. It's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do. And
Quotas. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, all of that.
Yeah.
And now I find that the sort of central government departments are, civil service, as you say, are great. They have fast track initiatives for disabled candidates and they're doing all sorts of really good stuff. But public sector more broadly, so local authorities, even dare I say the NHS, don't seem to be as on board as central government or many of the private sector. I think we still have some education to do there, which is a shame because there is so much potential in all those organisations.
Well, and I think certainly what we found is that in say big telcos like British Telecom, they've got an able to network of disabled
Yeah,
people who they
absolutely.
use, so that becomes a sounding board internally for then how they then push things out to their customers. And
Yeah.
that awareness, and of course you need that down at a local government level if people are dealing with people with different disabilities. But there's a really interesting flow through from the diversity of employment, Benny. Right,
Yeah.
Monica,
Okay. So
I
let
cut
me.
you off,
No,
Monica. Go on.
want to try to push a little bit towards telecom. So you work with everybody. I mean,
Yeah,
in different sectors,
including BT.
including telecom. Is there anything that strikes you? Is it better? Is it worse? Because from the inside, we always kind of like criticize ourselves. But how does telecom compares to the rest of the world?
I
If
mean, I think telecom to a large extent is a technology sector. And we tend to find that we have candidates who are great in the technology sector, and absolutely not to stereotype, because I'm not saying every autistic person is good at programming. That's not the case. But there is a draw often towards technology from people with neurodivergent conditions. And so we find that sectors like telecom, like technology, do very well in terms of neurodivergence, and having people who think differently or who are really good at spotting patterns or spotting where there's a mistake in coding can be much quicker and easier for someone who doesn't think like I do. For example, I'm boring and neurotypical. So I think a lot of the telecom and that kind of sector that rely on technology to a large extent are doing much better in terms of neurodivergence than maybe some of the other sectors are. But then when it comes to other conditions, so whether it's mental health or whether it's mobility or whether it's sight impairment or hearing impairment, maybe not quite so well all the time. And so I think there's still a lot of potential in every sector. I don't think there is a sector that's got it right yet, but there are certainly sectors who are understanding more. And I think those that are based around technology certainly are appreciating and understanding the benefits of diversity of thought and the different kind of perceptions and perspectives that people can bring with them if they have a different lived experience.
Yeah, and I guess that one thing is, like I say, you need to do more education is, and I don't want to stereotype things here, but there is a sense in which, as you say, there might be some type of disability that is better suited to some sector than another. So again, it's not 100%, but
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
actually useful for the company to understand how to navigate the universe so that they
Yeah.
can, because let's say that you do have a commitment, but what is the best way to leverage that? You see what I'm saying? Like, so
Yeah.
it's not really trivial. Who is that you should be looking at in your pool?
Yeah, I mean, for me,
So,
the quick answer is anybody that has the skills you're looking for. And sometimes we get employers who will say to us, what kind of jobs can disabled people do? And it's a bit like saying, what kind of jobs can people with blonde hair do? The disability is irrelevant. There are lots of jobs I can't do, nothing to do with my disability, but just because I couldn't be a Russian translator because I don't speak Russian. It's got nothing to do with my spinal condition. So for me, it's about being open to, talent comes in all shapes and sizes and colors. And for me, it's about looking at what talent somebody brings with them rather than what their condition might be, because that could be irrelevant. It could be a positive, but it's likely to be irrelevant. It's more about, can we get someone who has the skills that we need? And that requires an organization to think a bit differently. So it needs to think a bit more differently about candidate attraction and a bit more differently about candidate assessment. So what does our recruitment process look like? Are we excluding potential candidates who could be perfect for our roles because we're not advertising in the right place, or we're excluding them at some point in the recruitment process? So for me, this is about diverse talent. And yeah, we can talk about disability, but it's about any organization wants the best person for the job. And for me, if we include disability inclusion within that process, we're not going to exclude the person who might be the best person for the job. If that makes any sense. So
And what does that mean, or what do you need in place in a company, big or small, in terms
yeah,
of the people? Because HR, I think, is a very misunderstood part of organizations,
yes,
as in it's there to get the best out of the people for the business, right? Whereas when you
yeah,
start off work, you're thinking they're there to give you a nice, comfortable position, but actually, so they're a bit more exploitative than perhaps we would have thought of
yes.
originally. So what do they need in place in terms of the HR side, in terms of senior management? Because often, I'll give one example, is a BT, for example, introduced a mobile service specifically for people with hearing impairment,
Yeah,
partly because one of the senior execs had a hearing impaired child.
yeah.
So that sort of sponsorship, that sort of leadership, from on high, I guess I suspect in companies like Apple, that's quite embedded in the organization now, or in Microsoft, where they've done a lot of inclusion and accessibility work.
Well,
But
I mean, yes and no. I mean, without picking on particular organizations, I think what's needed is there's a nebulous thing and there are some very practical things. So the nebulous thing is about the perception of disability and inclusion generally, and it seems to sit in HR. And I'm not sure it should, because for me, it's not just an HR issue, it's a finance issue, it's a tech issue, it's a marketing issue. So we need to be marketing to all of the population, whether they're disabled or not. We need to be allocating finance to the right places within the business, whether that's marketing to disabled people, whether it's providing assistive technology. So for me, the attitude of the organization and its leadership needs to be that this is a strategic business issue. It's not something that's just the responsibility of HR. It should be everybody's responsibility. And that
yeah,
example you gave, Chris, is great because we often find our initial conversations, if we talk to someone and they say, oh, yeah, my wife's had a stroke, or yeah, my son's
yeah.
autistic, you know that you're going to have a much better conversation
Of
because
course, yeah.
you don't need to, people have got that lived experience, that knowledge that many people don't have, and that's no fault of theirs. We only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know.
So
But
so
for
to
me,
to,
that
to
leadership
go on.
sorry, that leadership is crucial. You can do it from the bottom up, but it's much, much harder. If you've got a leadership team, or at least sponsors within the leadership team who are saying, this is a priority for this organization, it becomes a priority for everybody within the organization. Whereas if you have somebody who may be, a recruitment consultant within the HR team who's really passionate about it, it's much harder to get change made because you've got to get resources, you've got to change people's thinking, you've got to be a decision maker. It can happen, but it's much harder. So I think leadership is really, really important. But seeing inclusion as a strategic business priority, everything else leads from there, because then it is about, okay, so what budget do we need for assistive technology? What budget do we need for outreach with marketing to diverse communities? What budget do we need for making sure our recruitment process is as barrier free as it can be? So it needs to be central to the business, not a kind of nice to have add-on or shoved in a kind of charity of the year or CSR box.
Oh, well, you've hit
But
one of the hot buttons there, haven't you? Which is the charity question. So
Yeah.
in some telcos I deal with, and I talk to them about exclusion, accessibility, they go, "Oh, you need to speak to the charitable bit, the foundation
Yeah.
bit, whatever," and go, "No, this is a
Oh,
mainstream issue."
yes.
So how do you work with charities with the third sector?
Yeah,
Is
we
that
work with the third sector in a number of ways. So one of them is as clients, so we can help them to attract disabled candidates because they are employers. Very sadly and frustratingly, a lot of, and again, I won't name names, but a lot of the large disability charities actually employ very few disabled people, particularly at the top. They might have an advisory board or their board of trustees, but the actual executives and the senior leadership team are often woefully lacking in terms of disability. So we work with them to help them attract good disabled candidates and to work with them as, to train them, give them consultancy. We also help disability charities who are supporting disabled people into work by being the job board they can use at the end of that process. So if there's an organisation like RNIB or like Scope or, like many of the Leonard Cheshire who give support to disabled people who are looking for work, often what happens at the end of that process is, right, you've got people who've got great CVs, they're confident in interviews, but where are they going to apply? And so that's where we come in and say, right, so those people that you're supporting into work, push them towards Evenbreak because we have a whole range of employers who actively want to employ disabled people. So it's a bit of a two-way relationship with charities. I am very anti the charity model of disability because I think it's traditionally it's been very much non-disabled people need to raise money to support these poor disabled people who have no agency. And that's definitely, a perception of disability that we want to challenge, that actually disabled people do have agency and should have choice and aren't charity cases and need to be involved in, that nothing about us without us thing. We need to be involved in not just decisions that affect disabled people, but all decisions that affect the business in whatever way it might be.
now this brings a very important issue, I think, because yeah, it should be part of it.
Yeah.
You're not just, it should be any patronizing attitude. But then when you look at all the DEI and all the kind of backslash that you have on some of that stuff, I think it's really because on one hand you can say, well, you need to have an active effort to bring more disabilities, but if that becomes we need a quota, we need a special thing, it looks like implicitly you're recognizing that kind of part of your targets are not as good, because otherwise you wouldn't need any special.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
see what I'm trying to kind of present both arguments here. But on the other hand, if you don't do anything, you might not be
Nothing changes.
successful. So how do we kind of balance this? And from the job applicant point of view, should you just be really upfront of this is my disability, or to say, well, since this doesn't matter, I shouldn't really push on that. But on the other hand, if I know that if I say I have disability X, I'm going to be more likely to get a job because there will be going to be jobs allocated to my group, then there is an incentive to present my disability, and so reinforce this kind of thing that I need special attention because I'm disabled, which you
Yeah. It
shouldn't.
is.
I mean, you don't. Well, you shouldn't because you don't need it.
Yes.
You
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, no, but I would not want to be given a job because I'm a woman and they've got a woman's quota. I would only want to be given a job because they think I can do it well and they appreciate the value that I bring. And that's the same with disability, with race, with sexual orientation, with anybody with a difference. So I'm not a fan of quotas because it's tokenistic. When we had a quota in the UK many, many years ago, before the DDA, we had a 3% quota that any organisation above a certain size had to employ 3%, or 3% of their workforce had to be disabled. We got an awful lot of disabled car park attendants. It doesn't work. We just get people in to do jobs that really aren't suitable, to tick a box, and nobody wants that. So for me, it's about changing the narrative around disability. Whereas at the moment, as you say, if in America, for example, they have tax incentives for taking on disabled people. And to me, that's a bit like we need to bribe you because otherwise, why would you employ disabled people? And, we need a quota in Germany or Italy or wherever, Egypt, where they have mandated quotas, is again saying we've got to give you a quota because you won't do it otherwise. And some companies don't. They pay the fine rather than employ disabled people, which is shocking. But I think we need to change the whole narrative around disability. And it's hard to do because it's been entrenched, like racism has been so entrenched in our society. It's hard to just flick a switch and it's gone. It's the same with disability. Disabled people were traditionally shut away from society, so people didn't have to sully their eyes by even knowing they existed. That's not quite the case now, but it's still the case that disabled people are seen as either objects of pity or benefit scroungers or inspirational role models like Paralympians. And very, very few of us fit into any of those three categories. We're just ordinary people who face additional barriers, trying to get on with our lives the best we can. And actually, as I said before, because of that, we do bring additional, not that kind of inspiration porn type thing, but we do bring additional skills with us because we have to develop skills just in order to get through the day. So I think rather than saying to an organization, oh, we'll give you an incentive to employ disabled people, the incentive is there itself. You're going to get talented people within your business that is going to benefit your business. Why would you need an incentive? But in order to obtain that benefit, you are going to have to do things differently. You might have to look at your recruitment process. You will have to provide adjustments. You will have to work more flexibly, but that will benefit your business as a whole. It's a little bit like, flexible working used to be called family friendly working, and it was really for mothers of young children. And very quickly, we realized that so many people benefit from flexible working, parents of any gender, but also carers, people who are doing studying and want time off, people who don't choose to work full time for whatever reason. And actually, flexible working is flexible working now. And I think it's the same with workplace adjustments. At the moment, it's seen as a legal requirement to provide reasonable adjustments for disabled people. But actually, a good organization wants everyone to be able to work in a way that suits them. So I remember talking to someone at Lloyd's Banking Group in their workplace adjustment team, and they said that there was something developing that they called chair envy. So somebody who had a particular spinal condition would have this amazing, really expensive chair. Everything on it was adjustable and headrests and blow-up cushions for the lumbar bit and all the rest of it. And then other people in the office were saying, why can't I have a chair like that? That person's got a chair like that. But if you have an atmosphere that says, we want all of our people to have what they need to be as productive as they can, then somebody isn't going to have chair envy because they're going to think, well, actually, my chair's fine. What I really do need, though, is a wrist rest because my wrists get painful, or I need flexible working because I'm doing an OU course and want some time off to study, or I'm so if every person within the organization feels valued and supported, we don't then have to worry, sorry about that, we don't have to worry so much about reasonable, legally defined adjustments for disabled people.
And I think to that point, I think, when I started working 40 years ago, adjustments for someone with a vision impairment were actually really expensive and clunky.
Yeah.
It didn't do the job. Whereas where we are today with the assistive technology of all sorts, a lot of it is becoming more mainstream.
Yeah, and look at an iPhone, how accessible an iPhone is.
Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, I can almost run my whole business on it. I don't.
Yeah.
I choose to use a laptop as well. But then, and to go back to where we started on AI, then that helps as well because the ability to deal with massive amounts of content, to be able to interact, use different interfaces, use different channels is really changing it. Can I just take you back to the I was going to ask you a two-pronged question, one about regulation and one about the different geographies. I mean, we've got the European Disability Act coming in June this year, I think it is.
Yeah.
Does that help, or does that just scare people a bit more? And anywhere around the world where you think they have got it vaguely right, as from a regulatory, from a sort of country point of view?
I think I've got sort of mixed feelings about legislation because legislation tempts you to do the minimum you need to do not to be sued.
Yeah.
which is not going to bring you the benefits of inclusion. And it can frighten people because it feels like a stick rather than a carrot. But on the other hand, I noticed that the year that mandatory pay gap reporting on gender came in, everybody I spoke to in DE and I roles in large companies was saying, sorry, we haven't got time for disability this year. We've got to look at gender. So
Brilliant.
it really did focus their minds. And so I think I'm in favor of mandatory reporting on disability inclusion, whether that's a pay gap or whether it's how many people and where they are within the organization. I think that's probably a good thing because it does focus our minds on, oh, actually, we do need to think about this. But on the other hand, it can build resentment in that I just want to run my business. I don't want you to tell me who I need to employ. I want to employ the best people. So I think again, the narrative should be around, yeah, there are things that you've got to do, for legislation, but actually this isn't about legislation compliance. This is about making your
Yeah.
business fit for purpose and doing what it should be doing. And I think in terms of countries that are doing things well, typically Scandinavian countries are pretty good at this stuff. I think different countries are good at different parts of it. If I look at, for example, somewhere that you wouldn't expect, the Middle East, for example, which can be quite bigoted in some inclusion areas, gender thinking of, particularly. But at the moment, they do have a focus on disability, more around physical disability. And I've been to Dubai, and it's a very modern city. So when it's been built with inclusion in mind, which most of it, like London, wasn't, because it's a very old city and it's quite difficult with narrow streets and listed buildings. But they have very ornate ramps at the front of buildings in Dubai, rather than you've got to go back round the tradesman's entrance. So they're quite good at that, but they're not very good at other bits. So I think you can pick bits from different countries and say that they are doing well. I think the Nordic countries tend to be the leaders in this area.
Yeah.
There are some things that America does really well. There are some things that America thinks they do really well, but actually perhaps aren't as good, like the tax incentives. To me, that smacks a little bit of a bribe. So I think there are things that we can take from every country and learn. But also for me, it's about how do we share the best practice from countries and companies who are doing this really well so that people haven't got to start from scratch every time and can actually say, actually, they're doing that. It might not work quite like that in our organization. We can adapt it and maybe, so we're sharing that best practice. We shouldn't be precious about it.
And by the way,
Yeah, we should have the humility to learn from others. So actually, I was
Absolutely.
doing a podcast the other day on women, and there was women from India, US, working on both. And what they
Yeah.
were saying, which is kind of surprising, is that actually India is doing much better than US
Yeah.
for women.
Yeah.
And when you go to a US audience, they will say, real, like it just like can't
Yeah.
possibly be. But we need to learn, and this is just not what is that others have done that works and what
and
doesn't.
China,
Like,
by the way, Monica. Yeah,
and
China's the same. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say China's the same. In our industry, you get a lot of senior females in the Chinese technology industry. So yeah,
yeah,
I think
I think we should all be open to learning, and nobody has got there yet. I don't think, we only employ disabled people. We still make mistakes. We're still learning. We'll always be learning. New things happen, new conditions appear, like long COVID was never a thing until very recently. New technology comes up, new ways of working. The pandemic was disastrous in so many ways, but it did bring to the forefront different ways of working.
yeah,
Hopefully, we're not sliding back to insisting everybody being back in the office full time, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I think there is a tendency for some companies to be doing that. But we learnt from the pandemic that there are different ways of working that can be equally, if not more effective. And I think we need to continue that learning process. And we know that learning organizations do better. We know that diverse organizations do better, even if you're just looking at
yeah.
financial results.
One
yeah,
question
absolutely.
for
And you
you.
don't want to live in a place where you don't learn. That would be
No.
so boring.
No,
It would be like
yeah.
hopeless.
And you get
So
left behind as a company because, the leading edge companies are going to just march ahead of you.
So can I take you back to the comment about the Middle East? Because I was on
Yeah.
something the other day, and they said for the UAE, this is the year of inclusion. They're like
Yeah.
an annual. And So in the language that we use around this, does inclusion cover? It should cover everything because it should be inclusive.
Yeah.
But I suspect there's sub trends within there that perhaps the UAE authorities have got in mind. You know,
Yes.
does it mean for them perhaps promoting more females into business, into society? You know, does
Yeah,
disability?
it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I say when we talk about inclusion, it's a bit like pregnancy. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. And if
Yeah.
you're saying you're inclusive to this group, and this group, but not that group or that group, that's not inclusion. You know,
Yeah.
inclusion must include everyone. My understanding about UAE is that their inclusion very much includes disability. We're doing quite a bit of work out there at the moment, which is great in the retail industry, particularly, but also in other sectors. And I think disability is on their agenda when they're talking about inclusion. I don't know about other forms of inclusion. So I would hope that it is intersectional because, you know, as we always say, disability doesn't discriminate. So, you know, you can be black and disabled, you can be female and disabled, you can be gay and disabled, you can be all of those. And so
And old
and
and
old,
disabled.
yeah, I'm 64, so definitely that one. And of course become more disabled the older we get, which is
Oh yes, yeah.
one of those things.
And actually, one of the things I must point out is that so being visually impaired, obviously I've had assistance through that, but I'm also losing hearing in my right ear at the moment. So I've started working with hearing aids, and it
Yeah,
makes you realize how the technologies don't necessarily combine very well
yeah,
because
one or the
because they
other.
because they've been developed in isolation for each different disability. Whereas, you know,
Yeah,
we know for the elderly population, they're going to have some motor issues, they're going to have some visual issues, they may have cognitive and hearing issues. So, you know, there is another piece of it, which is making sure that people designing this technology, and there's
yeah,
also a crossover between consumer electronics and healthcare, as we know, which is a
yeah,
fascinating thing as well, that we've got to make sure they're aware of that design for everybody and not just for the hearing impairment.
yeah, absolutely. Universal design is absolutely
Mm.
crucial. Yeah.
Okay, guys, time
Time
up.
out.
We already went beyond our allotted time, but it was a very exciting discussion. So I didn't want to stop it before, but we have to go. So, well, Jane, thank you so much
Thank you
for
very much.
being with us today. And Chris, do I
Brilliant.
have to
Thank you.
thank
And I
you?
really enjoyed that. Thank you for bringing that perspective to the table. Really enjoyable.
My pleasure. Thanks very much indeed.
Absolutely, absolutely, and obviously to all of you guys listening to us, we really appreciate it, and do subscribe to the feed if you are interested in inclusively. Thank you very much.